Part 5, Special Case of Environmental Activism. Only the environmental movement is naturally equipped to take on these challenges. But because of a dependency on the methods of community organizing for its support base, it is easy for energy generated by focused actions to slip away, energy which could go to addressing global issues. Leadership must consistently make clear to those working with them and to the media that covers actions that the focused activities are a singular part of a much larger movement with global concerns directly related to the action being taken. Creating a public and media habit of seeing local action as part of a global effort is vital. The plutocracy is benefited when each individual environmental action can be framed as isolated, weak, and trivial. When environmental activism is focused primarily on immediate concerns and not expressly relating local activism to resolute global conceptions of purpose, then the dark side forces of environmentally destructive plutocratic interests will control events that overwhelm. Thousands of individual destructive actions that spread thin the capacities of activists to respond. Social movements can keep attention on issues and make marginal, though locally important changes. But ultimately, the asymmetry of power to influence events is overwhelmingly on the side of the plutocracy. The whole variety of social, economic, and political activist movements need to append environmental issues to their other more focused concerns because, 1, environmental issues almost always underlie the issues that they are working on. 2, a broader support system can be formed as the many different activist organizations adopt some common language and bridging interests. And 3, combining the power of many organizations can create the force and energy needed by the environmental movement on the one hand, and can leverage that energy back to the focus projects of the various groups on the other. An inhabitable world is the first necessary condition for everything else. But the environmental movement and activist movements generally have no inherent, naturally motivated power base. That base must be created. While the general population has a natural interest in their own well-being, what is to constitute that well-being isn't at all clear to most people. Much of the activist agenda has been reframed by plutocratic propaganda as dangerous to jobs, lifestyles, personal safety, and beliefs. Activist movements need the strength of centralized organizations to challenge that narrative. We cannot wait for environmental failures to convince people of the dangers that we all face. There just isn't a sufficient power base for either the magnitude or the urgency of the changes needed to be made. The public is too fragmented and misinformed. Governments have become, especially on these issues, deeply compromised by wealth power. With the people and government compromised, a cold-eyed critical analysis leaves the uncomfortable conclusion that only a coalition of activist movements and great wealth remain with a chance of organizing what could potentially be humanitarian-like solutions to coming environmental and social crises. Activists have the knowledge and activist base. Great wealth has impunity-level power control over the widest array of human activities. Of course, the activist community must make every effort to inform the public and to influence governance, but with clear understanding that these efforts, while necessary and power-creating, are insufficient on their own. We are watching, in our own and international politics, authoritarianism, opportunism, and demagoguery taking political power as human actions are disconnected from the real environmental dangers facing us. Such self-serving governance only increases the stresses on economic, social, and environmental systems. Assuming that we survive these command-control totalitarian responses to our present confusions, what comes next will be determinative. It must be taken as reality that the plutocracy has so fortified the power of wealth that there is no effective challenge possible. The only option being talked about, when options are talked about at all, is taxation. However, the fundamental design of the tax code puts the writing of taxing legislation largely in the control of the rich. What we have seen up to now is great wealth organizing to maintain the industrial level domination of environmental and social concerns. With only regard for short-term gains, these powerful economic interests create a plethora of seemingly incomprehensible humanitarian and ecological disasters. But it seems almost inevitable that some wiser elements of the plutocracy will realize that only by engaging with the relevant activist movements can the more devastating consequences of social and environmental collapses be minimized. It must be increasingly realized that there would be no protection for anyone in an uninhabitable world. Great wealth has hands on the real levers of power. The activist movements have essential knowledge and a dedicated workforce. As uncomfortable as it may be, the power of great wealth in the present world is ubiquitous and overwhelming. If that power stands in the way of ecological stability, it will not happen except as an extinction event. If elements of wealth power can have sufficient overall influence in combination with academic and activist powers, the need for humanitarian solutions, in the Panglossian sense, could at least be possible. Given the time frame of environmental degradation, every other potential action appears to lead either to violent revolutions from which there can be no recovery, or resource wars from which there can be no recovery. The environmental movement is uniquely positioned to respond to and guide such coalition efforts. There are a number of international organizations well positioned for such an effort. While it is completely unclear how a coalition of a cabal of plutocrats and the most far-sighted environmentalists could directly address the three great challenges: destructive wealth inequity, dismal worldwide state of social justice, and the destruction of the environment, the power control of great wealth and the knowledge social base of the environmental movement could potentially be organized on an international scale with sufficient real power control over government and business interests that the most essential changes in human impact on the environment will be made possible. If this sounds both unlikely and very dangerous for a beneficent future, it would be both. There would be many ways that these kinds of forces for change could go very wrong. But reflect, there would be no greater danger than the consequences of going on as we are.